All right, boys, let's move on to our losers. So those picks from this offseason. So, Case, we'll go back to you with yours.
Yeah, there was a handful of losers that I had, and for the sake of not beating a dead horse, I thought I'd pick one that's not one that I've been talking about, and certainly not one I talked about 6 weeks ago when we last had an episode, and that's the Tampa Bay Lightning, who is taking a considerable step back here. Not quite as bad as maybe Boston, but Tampa Bay losing Killorn, Ross Colton, Ian Cole, and their whole fourth line of that gritty playoff fourth line of Pat Maroon, Perry, and Bellemare, and not really bringing anyone of note in except for Connor Sheary, is, if you can even call that of note, and then going ahead and making a big dollar spend once again. They're in this situation where they have to give up a Ross Colton because they've been shelling out massive contracts to guys, and they did it again the other day, giving Brandon Hagel a $5 million raise for the next 8 years. That's $6.5 million for 8 years for a guy who has had 1.5 really good seasons. So that contract kind of, I just shook my head when I saw it, because you're giving up on such a good young guy in Ross Colton because you have no money. You're giving up on a Killorn, who is your horse in the playoffs, because you have no money to spend on them. And just seeing that contract came out the other day, that was the straw that broke the camel's back for me, and that's really what made them the losers for me, after seeing so many subtractions, really no addition, and that contract.
Yeah, I'm a bit more hesitant to say that Tampa is a loser of the offseason, just based on history and their track record of either finding guys in free agency or through trade or from their farm system to come up and make an impact. So maybe they have, 1 to 3 guys who they think are going to be able to do that. I mean, surely that's the plan, losing all of those players and not replacing them immediately. So I'm a bit more hesitant to say that they're one of the losers of the offseason, just because I don't want any bad juju coming the Maple Leafs way here. But I agree with a lot of what you said there, Casey. Like, they haven't done much. They've overpaid for a few contracts. They're really making their bed here in terms of the players that they're signing, and kind of making some massive gambles on term. So we'll see if that all pans out going forward. But in terms of this season alone, I don't know exactly how good Tampa is going to be. I know the Atlantic is going to be better top to bottom, so it might be a bit more difficult for Tampa Bay to be in a playoff spot. But at the same time, I feel like they're going to make the money work somehow. They'll go out at the deadline and they'll add somebody or a few players and make it work. So, again, a bit more hesitant than you are to label them losers of the offseason, but I do agree they're definitely worse going into this year than they were at the end of last season.
But you can't afford to be worse going in this year when you're competing in the Atlantic, you're competing in the East. Everyone else in the East is getting better, except for, I don't know, the Islanders and Philadelphia. Philadelphia is trying to get worse, and the Islanders did literally nothing. So,
yeah,
everyone's getting better. I think doing nothing is a loss in this offseason in the East, and then actually getting worse is even worse. I don't know. I'm rambling and not making any sense.
No, I hear you. You're making sense. Listen, if I say Tampa is the loser of the offseason, Case, and I agree with you, then they're going to beat the Leafs in the first round this year.
Yeah.
So I cannot do that in good conscience.
They're still going to be a good team, still going to be a playoff team, but yeah. I think that every other team took one step on them this year. So it's going to be tough.
Agreed. The Atlantic is going to be so exciting. I can't wait until we do that episode to preview the Atlantic, because holy smokes, there are 8 really good teams now. I shouldn't say really good. There are 8 competitive teams top to bottom, and unlike years past, where the top 4 were virtually set before the season even started, this year it's completely wide open, and that is exciting.
Yeah, absolutely, and Case, I can get your rationale for Tampa Bay being a loser of this offseason. You look at that forward group especially, and it's a little depleted depth wise. They're really making some bets and guys with low cap hits, and we're talking about players like Logan Brown, Michael Asimon, Josh Archibald, not exactly a ring endorsement on some of those players. The guy for me who I think they're betting on and counting on to have a big year in his first full season in Tampa is Tanner Jeannot. I think that will be a big difference into, the success and the depth scoring that this forward group has. He only had 1 goal in 20 games with Tampa after coming over in that trade. So, I never count out the Tampa Bay Lightning. Let's remember that this is their first full rested summer in 3 years, so we got to take that into account, and even though they've lost the Killorns and the Palots and the Coltons and the list goes on, a lot of their top guys are still there, and regardless of how we feel about some of the contracts, there's some damn good players on this team still. So but it's going to be interesting in an Atlantic Division that, as you mentioned, Chad, is tightening up fast and is only going to make the East better. But for me, the one guy I'm really watching this year in Tampa is Tanner Jeannot, because they gave up a boatload to get him. We've ripped that trade multiple times on this podcast, as you guys know. Really curious to see how he is going to play this year for the Lightning, and I think that'll be a big factor into what their depth is like this season. So not ready to be so hard on the Lightning with their top guys, but it's going to be interesting. Definitely see the rationale for them taking a bit of a step backwards.
Well, Harp, I want to thank you for that, because you saying that they're really relying on Tanner Jeannot this year, I think only furthers my argument that they are losers in this offseason. I cannot believe that they traded a first, a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth for 1 goal in the regular season and 0 points in 3 games in the playoffs. So,
boy.
Hate that deal.
Cal Foote was included in that deal as well, who's in New Jersey.
And Cal Foote.
Yeah.
And going back to our discussion about that trade when it happened, I remember the one thing I mentioned was that I thought that team needed to get better on the back end. And then all of a sudden it's the playoffs, and a guy like Eric Chernak gets hurt. And then all of a sudden you're looking at that decor and it's like, oh, well, Ian Cole has to play 18 minutes now, who, again, isn't there. All of a sudden, Sergachev has to play 26 minutes a night when Hedman's out. And it's like, I don't know, man. That defense core isn't as good as it once was. And I think they need help there. So maybe that'll be a deadline ad for them this season. They'll trade another whole draft class for like Ben Sherratt or something, but it's one of those things, man, where yes, they didn't make a lot of moves. Yes, you can criticize how the team is built now, but at the same time, they still have all of their horses, all of their guys, the Stamkos, Stamkos and Kucherov and Vasilevsky and Hedman and all of those guys who are now rested. So it'll be interesting to see how they do. And I'm sure if Nate Gagne was on the podcast right now, he'd be telling us that, they're going to win the President's Trophy and then go on to win another cup. So it'll be interesting to see how Tampa does this season.
Yeah, he'll say they only let all those guys walk because they need to sign Stamkos next year.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is. Stamkos is up after this season, which will be another interesting thing to watch out for in Tampa. The last thing I'll say, boys, is it'll be. We'll see what this team looks like if they can't stay healthy and they run into injury problems. Then we'll really see the depth or lack thereof being tested. So anyway, they'll be an interesting team to watch for sure.